A ceasefire went into effect early this morning between Israel and Hezbollah that will end fighting after 14 months of violence. The agreement requires Israel and Hezbollah to pull back forces from the border region, allowing civilians on both sides to return to their homes. An international monitoring committee led by the United States will work to ensure that peace holds. Joining us to discuss this and more, Jesse Byrnes, senior editor here at The Hill. Jesse, thanks for coming on. The big question is, can this deal hold? It strikes me that President-elect Trump will be in office at the end of January. He promises to strike a harder line against Iran. Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran. The rivalry between Israel and Iran is far from settled. What do you think the prospects for this ceasefire to hold are?
Well, it's certainly good news for the Biden administration, who are trying to reach as many deals in the waning days of his administration before he leaves office as possible. But you're right, it's a very tentative ceasefire. Both sides acknowledge that it could be broken very easily. There's already skirmishes on day one of this at the border. And so there is going to be a lot of pressure on this U.S.-led committee who's overseeing this ceasefire. A lot of things have to go right for this to hold. You have to have Hezbollah move north, you have to have the Israeli troops move south, and you have to have that buffer zone between both sides hold. And in the past, that's been very tricky. The U.S. and several nations are going to be involved, the United Nations as well, in trying to be in that area and to oversee this. But certainly, I think both sides are kind of taking this one step at a time.
What does this mean for Gaza? It doesn't seem like there have been indications like we've seen with Hezbollah, between Hezbollah and Israel, that we felt like a deal was imminent. In Gaza, it seems like the opposite, that there's no end in sight.
Yeah, it's remained an elusive deal for the Biden administration. They've been pushing very hard for a number of months to try to get that before Biden leaves office. But at the same time, we saw Trump speak to Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority head, shortly after the election, kind of reopening lines of communication after frosty kind of relationship.
Trump has said he likes Abbas in the past.
Yeah, and I think that is something to watch too. Trump has obviously touted himself as a deal maker, trying to bring an end to the Ukraine war before he even takes office. For Israel, he does have a history of he does have leverage to some extent with the Israelis, of course, who like him and they like what he did moving the embassy to Jerusalem. But at the same time, this war has been really this deal has been elusive. Hamas has just not come to the table for the Biden administration, and we'll see if a change in administration on the U.S. part actually makes a difference.
Trump's ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, definitely striking a hard line, so it'll be interesting to see that dynamic if there's a deal that can be made. I want to come back home. We're getting these reports that members, nominees for Trump and appointees have been targeted with these threats. Representative Elise Stefanik, who's Trump's pick to serve as the ambassador to the United Nations, was one of the targets of these threats. A lot of these are kind of hoax threats. But surely, with the controversy surrounding the Trump administration, really any administration, the Secret Service is going to have its work cut out for it in protecting all these folks. Are these threats just kind of unfortunately normal for today's day and age in politics, or do you think the Trump administration's second term represents a unique challenge for the Secret Service?
Well, I think this is the new normal that we're living in right now. Obviously, we had 2 assassination attempts against Trump this year. These nominees who typically are not household names in this kind of very public-facing confirmation battle ahead for several of these nominees, they are becoming household names. They are going to be, their faces are plastered all over television. They're going to be in media. And so that adds another layer of complexity for the Secret Service, for the FBI. Several of these nominees are coming from Congress, so you have Capitol Police involved as well, with Stefanik in upstate New York, as well as Brooke Rollins out in Texas. Her home was targeted as well, she said. And so this is a unique challenge for federal law enforcement, but also for local law enforcement, and that coordination leading up to election day, or leading up to the inauguration.
The president of Mexico is responding to President-elect Trump's promise to enact 25% tariffs on imports from Mexico. Claudia Sheinbaum said Mexico would respond with tariffs of its own. Listening to some members of the Republican Party talk about this tariff policy, it almost seems like they're itching for a trade war, thinking that there might be some temporary pain initially, but ultimately it'll be forced production back in the United States, that we could deal with the pain in return for the prize on the other side. How widespread is that belief among the Republican Party, and is there a danger that it could cause to massive inflation?
Well, I think at large, we haven't seen Republicans really willing to criticize Trump on the issue of trade. Of course, trade tariffs can hurt people domestically in terms of prices, but it can also hurt U.S. manufacturers and farmers who are trying to export their goods abroad as well. And so there's definitely going to be real concern among their constituents for these Republicans who have really held their fire so far. On the issue of Mexico, though, I think you're seeing even some Democrats who are acknowledging that this could be a piece to try to get Mexico to the negotiating table. There's been a long criticism in Washington that Mexico hasn't done enough to try to stem the flow of illegal drugs pouring into the United States, as well as the controlling migration from Central America. And so this is certainly viewed widely as a negotiating tactic, but we're also seeing the Mexican government push back relatively early and trying to set the stage for that negotiation.
Yeah, Henry Quay, our Democrat from Texas, talked about this being a possible negotiating tactic. Is there any concern, though, that maybe it's not? I mean, because I think it's hard to overstate the impact of 25% tariffs on products from Mexico and China, Mexico and Canada, along with China, three of the biggest U.S. trade partners.
Well, there's definitely risk. For Mexico, 8 in 10 cars made in Mexico are exported to the United States. It's a huge manufacturing sector for Mexico. And so if there is the potential that you're going to have 25% tariffs, that certainly can impact them very deeply. And so they understand that there are risks to this. At the same time, there's things that they know the United States wants. And so I think there's going to be some kind of concessions on both parties in January and in the early months of Trump's term.
I want to talk about this battle over the location of Space Command headquarters. During the first Trump term, he identified Huntsville, Alabama as the eventual location for Space Command headquarters. There was a temporary home for it in Colorado Springs. That's still where it's located. Biden said we should just keep it there. It would cost too much money and endanger national security to change it. Members of the Alabama delegation, now that Trump's back in office, are hopeful it will move again. It just seems like what strikes me is like this is like typical government bureaucratic infighting that could end up being a huge waste of money if they move it again. What do you think about what's going on?
Well, you have a couple different things at play. You have the military aspect, which is members of the Colorado delegation, members of the military have warned for years that upending it from Peterson Air Force Base there in Colorado Springs and moving it across the country would hurt military readiness. And so I think there are some real concerns from the prior head of Space Force that this could actually hurt military readiness. Of course, Colorado Springs, there's a huge defense representation there. There's tens of thousands of members of the military that are there. And so there are real concerns from a military standpoint and defense standpoint. At the same time, you have politics, and you have members of the Trump sphere who have argued that politics was at play when Biden decided to remove it from Alabama and to put it in Colorado, or keep it in Colorado rather. And so that is, this is going to be something that is both sides. It's a blowing into the scene again, and there's going to be a lot of fighting over this. We saw Mike Rogers, the chair of the House Armed Services Committee, who's from Alabama, arguing that Huntsville is the place for it to be. And at the same time, even Republicans like Doug Lamborn in Colorado have argued, no, keep it in Colorado. There's a couple things to watch. In the next couple of months, we are expecting the Defense Department Inspector General, as well as the Government Accountability Office, to be looking at Biden's decision to put it in Colorado. And so I think the results of that will be interesting. Previously, Governor Watchdog had looked at Trump's decision, found that it was lawful, but that it could have been more transparent. And so we'll see if that actually impacts this discussion. At the end of the day, Trump's going to do what he wants to do with this.
What the price tag on it is what I'd be super interested in hearing. Jesse Byrnes, thanks so much for coming on. Appreciate your insight.
Thanks, Drew.
The White House announced Wednesday morning that 3 Americans, it says, were wrongfully detained in China have been released as part of a prisoner swap with Beijing. A spokesperson for the National Security Council confirmed that Mark Swatting, Kai Li, and John Leung have been freed in exchange for an unknown number of Chinese nationals detained here in the U.S. Swatting was arrested in 2012 on drug-related charges, while Li was detained in 2016 and Leung in 2021 on espionage charges. The National Security Council spokesperson says after the swap today, all wrongfully detained Americans in China are home. Meantime, a battle is brewing between the incoming Trump administration's immigration officials, and leaders of so-called sanctuary cities who say they will not comply with Trump's deportation policies. Robert Sherman is in Mar-a-Lago with the latest.
Team Trump is preparing for a showdown involving the U.S.-Mexico border and sanctuary cities as the president-elect sent his incoming border czar down to the U.S.-Mexico border, in which he insisted that there will be a large-scale deportation effort once the new administration comes in, and they are prepared to go toe-to-toe against these sanctuary cities who they anticipate will resist. One of those who has said that has been the mayor of Denver, who said that he would be prepared to go to jail over this issue. And then the city of Chicago has emphasized that they do not intend to cooperate with ICE unless there's a court order. Take a listen.
We are prepared to look across our administration, departments, agencies to continue to uphold the Sanctuary City Ordinance, the Welcoming City Ordinance, which gives protections to undocumented people. What that looks like on the ground is being developed, but at the bottom line, it means that we will not cooperate with ICE. Our CPD force will not cooperate with ICE unless there is a court order.
So on the one hand, you have the incoming Trump administration, which is asserting that they will not back down from the policies and objectives that they hope to implement. And on the other hand, you have these sanctuary cities saying that they will not kowtow to the federal government and they will continue to uphold the local policies that are in effect in their communities. Drew?
Thank you, Robert Sherman. For the second time in 2 weeks, unidentified drones were spotted flying over U.S. military sites in the United Kingdom. The Pentagon says it is now actively watching for more drones. The sightings took place over 3 different U.S. air bases in the UK. Installation leaders say the drones have not impacted the bases, personnel, or assets held there. The Pentagon says the military is working with UK authorities to get to the bottom of it. It comes a little less than a year after unidentified swarms of drones were sighted near military installations here in the U.S., including near Virginia's Langley Air Force Base. The federal prosecution of Donald Trump over his handling of classified documents is done. A federal appeals court agreed to the request of special counsel Jack Smith, who moved to end the case after Trump's election victory, citing DOJ policy that prevents the prosecution of a sitting president. Trump was charged with violating the Espionage Act and obstructing justice after an FBI search of his Mar-a-Lago resort found hundreds of classified documents stored in random locations throughout the property. Some of them were marked with the most sensitive classification levels. Trump was also accused of hiding evidence related to the case. Joining us to discuss this and more, Julia Manchester, national political reporter here at The Hill. Julia, thanks for coming on. You know, yesterday, a judge ended Trump's election interference case, also at the request of the special counsel, also for similar reasons, citing that DOJ precedent. There's this question out there, there's been some criticism of the DOJ, accusing it of essentially dropping the ball by waiting too long to bring these cases. Tell me about that criticism.
Yeah, look, Drew, Trump's critics, liberals, Democrats would have loved to see this case be brought sooner and for the DOJ to move faster on it because we're essentially seeing it dropped following the election. So President-elect Trump can go into the Oval Office, take the presidency without having to worry about these 2 federal cases against him. It's a classified documents case. And of course, the January 6th election interference case that Jack Smith dropped earlier this week. So there's that frustration that they didn't make more progress and they essentially didn't get to make any headway post the election. Now, there are 2 other cases at the state level in New York and Georgia, but it's very unclear where those 2 cases go from here. In New York, there's a question of when the sentencing or if the sentencing will happen. And then, of course, in Georgia, there's a question of how the prosecution moves forward because internal issues with the prosecution, namely Fani Willis, the lead district attorney, having a relationship with one of her other prosecutors on her team. So right now, this is a big victory for Trump. He can essentially forget about these federal cases and move into the presidency.
What do the defenders of the DOJ say about why it took so long? You know, it was like 2 years almost before Jack Smith was even appointed, and then another 7-9 months for him to bring those cases. What do his defenders say about why it took so long?
I think sometimes these cases, according to his defenders, according to attorneys, take some time. I mean, you can't snap your fingers and, have this happen, quickly. It is a process. And then on top of that, this was a very fragile political situation. You were dealing with the lead contender at the time to be the Republican nominee for president. You were also dealing with a former president at the same time. So there was a question of how to move forward and how to delicately move forward when you have a large portion of the country supporting this person to be president, and if the prosecution would look political or not, or biased in all of this. So I think that was definitely a concern in terms of how it moved forward.
Also have that Supreme Court immunity ruling that threw kind of a wrench in at least one of the cases. Want to talk about the Trump transition team has actually signed this memorandum of understanding. It allows officials to meet with their counterparts at departments and agencies ahead of the January transition of power. There had been some concern over delay in the signing of this document that the Trump team would not be able to hit the ground running. Are those concerns alleviated now that it's been signed?
I think those concerns are alleviated, but there still are, other worries about background checks. I mean, will there be internal background checks of a number of these cabinet appointments or nominees, or, federal appointments by the FBI, for example, or will they be, essentially done by an outside group? So there's questions as to how that impacts this. Look, if you can compare it to the Biden administration, they signed the internal that memorandum of understanding in September of 2020. So this is happening quite a bit after the Trump transition has taken place. So I think there are questions about the timing, but clearly the two sides looking to move forward, move together on the transition.
Kamala Harris addressed supporters during a call yesterday with some of her top donors. Let's take a listen and we'll talk about it on the other side.
The outcome of this election obviously is not what we wanted. It is not what we worked so hard for. But I am proud of the race we ran. I just have to remind you, don't you ever let anybody take your power from you.
Top Harris campaign officials were also on the Pod Save America podcast. Between that and the appearance there of Harris, there's been critics that say there's a lot of patting themselves on the back. Lindy Lee is a member of the DNC finance team. She says the Harris call amounted to was very self-congratulatory, and she said that she was stunned that there was not kind of a post-mortem and analysis of what she called a disastrous campaign. What do you make of the call and the Pod Save America appearance and the reaction that it's getting in the Democratic political world?
Look, I think there's two ways to look at this. First of all, critics are going to say that they didn't take enough responsibility, that there were a lot of excuses being offered here. At one point during that Pod Save America podcast, one of Harris's advisors, people who were on that show, essentially called some of the questions Harris was getting asked in interviews dumb. And there was a lot of defending as to how the money was spent. The defense of her going on the Call Her Daddy podcast, which I think cost money to build that set, to set that up. So there are a lot of legitimate questions, I think, that donors have right now that weren't being answered in this call with donors in the DNC and also on Pod Save America. At the same time, though, I think it's also fair to say, look, Kamala Harris did something that was very difficult to do. She ran, as Jen O'Malley Dillon said in that Pod Save America show, she ran a campaign that is normally run in 1.5 to 2 years in roughly 100 days. She was forced to put that together. Some of the aides on that show said that they weren't necessarily given a heads up about Biden stepping down. They were sort of thrown into the fire on this. So they were, sort of given an impossible task, and they felt they did the best they could with that. On top of that, they also acknowledged that they were facing very tough pro-Republican headwinds in the country. There was the economy that was working against them, or messaging on the economy from the Trump team that was working against them, and that they had a popular incumbent in President Biden. So I think there's different ways to look at this, but certainly there are Democrats, a lot of Democrats, who are saying they weren't satisfied with the messaging they got from that interview or on that call with Kamala Harris herself.
All right, Julia Manchester, national political reporter at The Hill. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
A new survey from Emerson College polling shows the president-elect is more popular than before the election. 54% of those polled view Trump favorably, compared to 48% before the election. To break down the numbers, we're bringing in Emerson College polling Senior Director Matt Taglia. Matt, good to see you again. First, walk us through the crosstabs here. Where did the president-elect gain support after the election?
Yeah, Drew, and as you said, it's 54% favorable for Trump, 46% unfavorable. It's an increase of 6 points since pre-election. We see some of his strongest numbers among the 40 to 59-year-olds included in the survey, 60% favorable. Also 55% among folks who are under 30. That's pretty substantial there. We do see a gender divide, 61% favorable for men versus 48% for women. And then we see some highs for him with white voters, 69%, 53% with Hispanics, and then even 19% among Democrats. That's a 9-point increase since the pre-election polling. I think it's fair to say that President-elect Trump is certainly viewed more favorably than he was prior to the election.
54% is for a new president. Is that about what you would normally expect to see? And is this post-election bump also something that's common?
Yeah, it is. We expect to see a bit of rallying here. If we look back to Biden in 2020, we see about the same favorability, 52% versus 46% unfavorable. By the middle of 2021, though, that had flipped entirely. And then if we look back to all the way back to 2012 with Obama, he was at 51% favorable versus 47% favorable at about the same time in November. Now, this is all a departure, though, from Trump in 2016. He entered office with 50% unfavorable, 45% favorable. So I think there is clearly some positive momentum here for Trump's public image. And it is a bit of a departure for him, but he's looking a little bit more like some of these other presidents.
You also looked ahead to 2028. It will be an interesting year with a double open primary, something we haven't seen since 2016. Who are voters' favorites to run 4 years from now, and were there any surprises for you in the responses?
Yeah, and one caveat to how we asked this question is that it was open-ended. So we asked folks who they would like to see 4 years from now as the nominee for the Democratic and Republican tickets, so they could write in whomever they wanted. And we see on the Democratic side, Harris picks up about 37% support. That's the first person who came to mind for over a third of Democratic voters. Newsom gets 7%, Pete Buttigieg 4%, and then Whitmer and Shapiro at 3% each. Obviously, Harris has a high number here. She's walking right out of the election. Even though she lost, it seems that she's still top of mind for Democrats. So that is a high number. It's a little surprising that no other candidate gets into double digits. If we look at Newsom's numbers, he gets a little bit more support from older folks and from folks with a high college degree or higher. And then turning to the Republican side, we ask the same question, and we find Vance with 30%. If we include Donald Trump in these numbers, he's at 23%, DeSantis at 5%, and then Ramaswamy at 3%. Hispanic voters and young voters in particular say Trump. Now, we aren't necessarily sure whether this means Donald Trump Sr. or Donald Trump Jr. or one of his kids. In some cases, it just says Trump, but they like the brand. We can see that as far as these Republican primary voters go. But I think otherwise, all else being equal, Vance is clearly a front runner here, a very early front runner. Remember, we still have three and some odd years before the first caucus and primary votes are cast. So this is mostly name ID right now, but J.D. Vance would stand to be in a front runner position here.
Very interesting numbers, but as you said, way too early to actually be discussing that seriously. Matt Taglia, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you, Drew.
The Walt Disney Corporation has agreed to a $43 million class action settlement. That's according to a court filing Monday. The agreement settles allegations over gender pay discrimination initially made in 2019, when a female employee claimed she was getting paid less than her male counterparts in the same role. More women later joined the case. Their case relied on a labor economist who conducted an analysis of pay data between 2015 and 2022 and found that women were paid a little over 2% less than similarly situated men. Disney disputes the findings. After the settlement, a spokesperson for Disney said in a statement to The Hill that the company has always been committed to paying its employees fairly and said they are pleased to have resolved the matter. Millions of dollars of stolen goods have been recovered in a massive organized retail theft operation in Queens, stretching all the way from New York way down to Maryland. 5 people are now under arrest, including a husband and wife. The crime crew targeted cosmetics, beauty products, designer clothing, and accessories stolen from transport trucks and directly from retail stores, including Macy's, Sephora, and Ulta Beauty. According to prosecutors, the alleged thieves also had a store in the Dominican Republic to resell the stolen items. Retail theft affects everyone's wallet. It's estimated the average American family pays an extra $500 a year to cover the cost of stolen merchandise. That's today's Daily Debrief. I'm Drew Petrimoulx. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.